The exchanges in Parliament today were, to be absolutely honest with you, pretty dreary. But people protesting about climate change this coming weekend are likely to change the atmosphere around Westminster pretty radically. Around 30,000 people have so far signed up online to join Extinction Rebellion protests and marches, which will coincide on Sunday with the London Marathon, giving the police a bit of a nightmare. But that, really, is only the beginning. Yesterday, I got an email from Extinction Rebellion calling on the government to stop the search for new fossil fuels immediately and transition towards reparatory justice, whatever that is, led by emergency citizens' assemblies. It said that if ministers fail to respond by 5 p.m. this coming Monday, XR and its allies would step up campaigns and actions across the country to force them to do so. It was designing a plan, and I quote, for the greatest act of civil disobedience in this country's history. So many questions. Full disclosure, I believe that we are in a climate crisis. I know that if that's true, we have to change our behaviour. I understand that the age of burning lots of fossil fuels must end. I also understand that our political system, the way our parties operate and Parliament functions, means that radical choices are very rarely seriously talked about there. But I don't know whether it's possible to stop using and therefore looking for oil and gas right now. What would happen to the economy we have, what the effect would be on people's living standards, what would happen to the food chain and what we eat, to our ability to travel, and to the thousands of everyday products we use today which employ hydrocarbons. I want to know what Extinction Rebellion mean by reparatory justice, and of course I also want to know what kind of things they're talking about when they speak of the greatest act of civil disobedience in our history. Talking of history, I wonder how they'll be seen in 30 or 40 years' time. We look back at the suffragettes, hugely controversial in their day as heroines. But we look back at the Luddites who broke textile machinery in the early 1800s as tragic opponents of human progress. Today, Extinction Rebellion is trying to wake the rest of us up. Doomsday is very close, they believe, and ordinary democracy is too slow and too stodgy. Very well. But do you change people's minds in the way you hope by disrupting their lives and making them angry? I'm not hostile, I'm just curious. Not so long ago, Extinction Rebellion changed tactics away from blocking roads and railways. Since then, they say, the government has doubled down on deadly climate chaos, and this is their last chance. Like I say, so many questions. Well, luckily, to help me answer them, I'm joined this evening by Clare Farrell, who's one of the XR co-founders. Clare, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
As I say, lots of questions there. Can I just start off with perhaps the most profound one, which is, can we actually simply stop using oil and gas right now without crashing the economy and causing lots of people listening to this programme a lot of misery?
Well, first thing that your listeners need to remember, be reminded of, if they did hear it even in the first instance, was that people such as Mark Carney have come out in the past and said that climate breakdown is going to cause the collapse of our economy. So the question is not whether or not getting off oil and gas is going to cause a collapse of the economy. It's whether or not we can get off it and whether or not we can prevent a collapse of our economic system. As for the demands of Just Stop Oil, of Extinction Rebellion and many other groups, nobody has ever said, turn the switch off right now. We've said the first thing you have to do if you're going to stop making it worse is stop new licensing, stop new investments, stop new projects. Like, you have to stop doing the thing that you're doing in order to stop doing it. Do you see what I mean?
Oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, for instance, no fracking.
Exactly. And we have not invested, as I'm aware, I'm not an expert in energy policy. You'd have to ask someone else to speak to you in more depth about this. But as far as I'm aware, we have not actually invested properly in the appropriate measures to do the transition as quickly and as swiftly as we ought to. And we were hosting the COP conference when we had, some of our leaders in tears on the world stage, fearful for the future, but give them a few months and they're backpedaling on their plans, they're not meeting their targets, they're making up stories about why, and then they're acting as if it's not their problem anymore, because they're not at the top of the story on the world stage, are they now? So
I suppose I'm accepting there has to be a transition, and it's really about the speed and the scale of the transition, because in effect we are kind of surrounded by the effects of hydrocarbons and oil and gas in what people wear, how they eat, all sorts of things, how they move around the country. And my question is, are you too ambitious in the speed of the transition you think can be made?
Well, the problem is we've wasted an awful lot of time, right? You know yourself about the misinformation campaigns, the programme of like following the tobacco lobbyists in smearing and confusing people. We've lost a generation to nonsense, basically, because nobody held up the truth. We also have a problem with the transition, which is that when you look at the requirements in terms of copper, in terms of minerals, rare earths, look at where they are in the world, and if they're necessary to the transition of the entire world's energy systems, then we also need to have a very serious conversation about how we're going to share resources globally, not just locally. And we can't even agree on insulating people's homes. We can't even agree on making public transport free or cheap.
So the system is too slow and too stodgy.
There are systemic responses that are required. This isn't about electric vehicles. It's not about a little bit of a transition and it's going to be incremental. Like, we've left it until the last minute, and it's like when you've not done your work and then you have to deliver it the next day, you either stay up all night and do it and you put every bit of effort into doing it, or you go, sorry, we're not doing it at all, I'm just going to skive off. Like, we're at that point where there is no time. And if I just might add, we are also not prepared for the impacts that are going to come, for mass flooding, for massive heat waves. Do not forget that last year it was 40 degrees and everything burned. We need to prepare and mitigate at the same time. So it's extremely difficult.
I get that. What is reparatory justice?
Well, we know that in history and to the present day, a lot of industry engages in exploitation, massive extraction, the destruction of natural environments, and we need to repair not only our relationships with each other in terms of, the international agreements have basically agreed to allow low-lying nations to disappear. There are some that I think are guaranteed
these are
to
payments
vanish.
to the nations that are likely to disappear.
Well, the concept of reparatory justice, as far as I understand it, is far deeper than just payments. It's not about just saying we can pay people off. There's a thing called loss and damage, which I think is a term which is going to increasingly look like rich countries think they can pay poor countries to destroy them in the process of not dealing with climate. Okay. That's not what reparatory justice is. That takes a more holistic approach to looking at what justice means and what your relationships mean.
So what might happen is the government might say, we've listened to you, we agree with you, we're going to do everything you say, but I would suggest that is unlikely. And so you've given them this deadline of 5 p.m. on Monday. What actually happens if they just ignore it?
Well, I think if they just ignore it, then they will know that we've got an awful lot of groups and friends who've come into the movement recently. There are people, don't forget, from business leaders. There are people from the third sector, from the charity sector, the NGOs. It will be a conversation across the entire breadth of the climate and the social justice space to say, what do we do next, seeing as we have a government which is ignorant, which is cruising towards collapse? I don't know about you, but I didn't vote in our democracy for collapse. I don't think anyone did. No. If that's what we're on course for and they're refusing to reckon with that, we have to force a conversation about it, don't we?
One of your co-founders talk about, the most dramatic public disobedience in history. And I'm just wondering what that actually means. Is it blocking railways? Is it blocking motorways and airports? What does it actually mean?
Well, I think that will remain to be seen, because we've got a new, I don't know if the right word is coalition, but we've got a new collection of groups and individuals who've come together. We've got thousands of people coming out with us at the weekend who've never done anything with XR before. We've used a whole bunch of different mobilisation techniques in order to create a breadth.
Well, it'll be very, very interesting to see what actually happens. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment. I'm going to just bring in Professor Sir David King, who was formerly UK Special Representative for Climate Change, for his view. Sir David, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if I can ask you, first of all, whether you think it is possible to make a really fast transition away from fossil fuels.
I think it is possible, Andrew, and at the same time is not on our side. We've just got to recognise that we are in an extremely challenging situation. And by this, let me just very quickly, if I may, say, what's happening in the Arctic Circle region is an accelerant on climate change throughout the world. In the Arctic Circle region, temperatures have risen now by 3 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level, and everyone has recognized the 1.5 degrees and above represents a very, very big challenge. 3 degrees centigrade above there means we're now losing ice on Greenland irreversibly. That means sea levels will rise by an enormous 7 to 8 meters by the time we get to the point where we've lost all the ice on Greenland. And quite simply, we know as well that methane will emerge from the permafrost regions around the North Pole, giving us a temperature rise of maybe 5 to 8 degrees centigrade on average around the whole planet. All of this is disastrous for our civilization. We are really at the point of extreme measures required to manage the challenge.
So we're at the point of extreme measures being required, Sir David. Do you sympathise or agree with Extinction Rebellion in the underlying sort of implication of this, which is that our current parliamentary system is simply too slow, too sluggish and not radical enough to deal with what needs to be done?
Our current parliamentary system is, I have to agree with them, too slow, too sluggish. We're not responding to the crisis that we're faced with. But it's not only our current parliamentary system, the global system. Where is the leadership in the world? We've lost the sense of British leadership, which we did have between 2008 and 2012, 2013, and we've lost that. Where is the leadership in the world on this enormous issue? Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, he gets it. He's making statements saying this is the biggest challenge our civilization has ever had to face up to. And who's facing up to it? We have a big crisis on our hands, Andrew. And it's difficult to disagree with what Extinction Rebellion is saying. I'm not talking about their methodology. I'm simply saying they have a critically important message to get across.
Professor Sir David King, thank you so much for joining me. I know that you had to change lots of arrangements to do so, so I'm particularly grateful. Listening to him, and still with me, is Clare Farrell, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. Clare, let me ask you the last, as it were, bundle of questions, which is really about tactics. Because at the beginning of the year, it wasn't so long ago, you said that you're going to move away from direct action tactics to building alliances, building relationships, and you clearly have with Greenpeace and trade unions and other groups. But you said that this would be that this is what you're going to do this year. We're only 4 months into the year, and you've changed again. And I'm wondering why, and bluntly, whether it's because Just Stop Oil and more radical groups have grabbed the headlines.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, the reason that we've taken this approach at the beginning of the year is because there is a bigger ecosystem of movements. It is because of people like Just Stop Oil, that people like Insulate Britain. There's more in the landscape that's taking up the sort of, flying the flag for radical direct action, and we support them, and we're very grateful for them being part of the mix. But what we recognised with XR was we've got a broader, older organisation that we could actually use at networks and our relationships to build a bigger, broader movement. And if what Sir David has just said is true, which is that civilization will collapse within the next, before the end of this century at least, and that what's happening is not being reported on. People don't have an emotional reaction that's appropriate to the fact that they may live through collapse, their children will definitely live through collapse, the trajectory we're on. Then, it's important that we go, why have we not got everyone on the streets with us?
I absolutely get that. But, there is a difference between what you've been doing recently and, Just Stop Oil disrupting the snooker and the horse racing and so forth. You said you don't want to disrupt the marathon, but the fact that you'll all be there makes it much likelier that Just Stop Oil or other groups will disrupt the marathon. My question is really, those kind of things make people angry. And because they're angry emotionally, they may not be won over to your arguments. In fact, the reverse.
Well, I'm glad you've raised that, actually, because I think there's an enormous amount of manufactured rage that gets produced by the tabloid media. And at our press conference just the other day, the Daily Mail asked us twice if we were going to disrupt the coronation, because we gave them the answer they didn't want, which was no. And if they want to disrupt it so much, perhaps they should go and do it themselves, because when we say we're not going to do something, they write about it anyway. I've been listed as an organiser in groups that I'm not part of, and then say to the Mail, why did you write that? And they go, well, because you're a protester. Like, you can't just throw things at the wall and see what sticks. That's not how journalism works. The news isn't meant to be made up. It's meant to be things that help people to orientate the real world. So what people really need help with is to understand that we are on their side. We need a movement that includes everyone. That's why we're doing what we're doing. And as David King has just said, we're on course for total breakdown.
But if you want to engage me, if you want to gauge my imagination, then making me angry about something may be a bad way of doing it, because the way our brains
But that's
work.
what I'm trying to say, is that we've been meeting with the marathon people since November last year to say, how can we share the streets of London responsibly? We have been liaising with them. That's working. We have a functional relationship with them. And still the tabloids have tried to engineer a sense of outrage because there might be something that we've said isn't going to happen. Do you see what I mean? So it's out of my hands what the media does with the narrative. What we really need is for journalists and broadcasters to pull together, perhaps a little bit like the lawyers have recently, and said, we're not going to vilify and prosecute climate protesters anymore, because the responsibility for this lies somewhere else. And this is just ordinary people trying to build social power against the powerful and against fossil fuels and against the interests of the very rich minority who are leading us to destruction, and that's what the government used this language, the selfish minority. There's not very many of them, is there? And there's much more of us, and we're frightened citizens. So I think everyone needs to understand that.
Final question. Would you say to people who are going to throw things at oil paintings or disrupt sporting events, stop it, you're not helping the movement?
Well, I'm considering speaking to people who are engaged in that part of the movement, and I wonder if it'd be helpful if there was an open letter to the public that just said, look, if you want people to stop doing this, if you want young people to stop making a fuss, help them. That's all people need to think.
A good note to end on. Clare Farrell, very interesting talking to you. Thanks so much for coming in. Now, coming up, the shocking story that more than 300,000 children in England have to share a bed with another family member because of overcrowding. The time now is 6:19.